Okay, so this is going to be a very different video than what I'm used to making. So today we're going to be talking about the fruity limiter. Okay, so this thing is pretty powerful. It does a lot of different things. And what caused me to want to make this video is I saw a post online of somebody asking for some underrated plugins that are in FL Studio. And a lot of people gave some really good answers, like Maximus. I think some people said just the EQ in general, the compressor. People gave a lot of good answers. My answer was the fruity limiter because I realized how often I use it, which is like all the time. And so in this video, I want to go over some of the different things that you can do with the fruity limiter. Now, this video probably won't be comprehensive, meaning I'll probably forget some things. So if there are any uses for the fruity limiter that I don't mention in this video, make sure to go down to the comments and let everybody know what that use is. If you want a video that goes in depth on, what compression is, what ratios are good for what things, what settings are really good for limiting and that sort of thing. Or if you want a video that goes in depth on the differences between limiting, compressing, blah, 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 this is not the video for that, okay? This video is only going to be going over, like, general use cases for the fruity limiter, okay? Okay, so to demonstrate the uses for the fruity limiter, I've got a whole bunch of different sounds pulled up. I've got these different melody loops that I created over the past, year or so. I've got some kicks thrown in here, and I've got a drum loop, okay? So let's start going over some of the uses for the fruity limiter. So for this first one, I've got this this melody, and this is what it sounds like. Okay, so the very first thing you can use a limiter for is obviously gain. So you can make things louder and quieter, obviously. So if I bring this gain knob all the way down, you don't see or hear anything because the volume's pulled all the way down. I can even make it louder than it was before. And quieter. So one of the obvious things you can do with the fruity limiter is, play with the volume. Another thing you can do is something called saturation. So you can see this. As I pull this knob down here, you're going to see this like red, like hazy kind of filter coming over the like the sound waves. And the further down you pull this into the sound wave, the more saturation it's going to have on it. So let's listen to the sound, the melody on its own. And let's start pulling saturation down into it. And you're not going to notice anything until this actually goes into the waveform itself. So let's start pulling it down. Until it's all the way down. Now let me boost the gain so we can hear it a little bit better. So without headphones on, it may be kind of hard to tell, what's happening here. But let's do a comparison by looking at the EQ. So here's what the EQ looks like without the saturation on it. All right, so let's look at the EQ once I start pulling the saturation down. So it looks like it's adding a little bit of extra noise down here in the low end. So if I pull this all the way back up, there's not as much happening down here. And let's keep our eyes down here on the high end. So let's pull this all the way down. It's kind of hard to notice. But yeah, visually you can see that there's a little bit of information being kind of added into this. And even if you can't see it, hopefully with headphones you can hear the difference. So one of the things you can do with this is you can add saturation. All right, so I've got this other sample here. So I'm going to go ahead and boost the volume of it so that we can hear it. So here's what the other sample sounds like. So one other thing that you can use the fruity limiter for is reducing dynamic range. And basically what that means is, if we look at this waveform, some parts of it are louder and some parts of it are quieter. That's what's known as dynamic range. So dynamic just means like changing or different. So if we have these loud parts here, and we have these quieter parts right next to it, you can actually reduce that and make it so that everything is more or less the same volume or closer to the same volume. And there are a bunch of different ways you can do this with the fruity limiter. One way is to take this limiting ceiling and bring it down. So if you bring this down, and this is again why I prefaced the beginning of the video, why this is not like an in-depth explanation on things. I'm not going to explain like how limiting works exactly, or compression, like I said. All this is doing is demonstrating the effects so that we can like hear it and see it visually and, just get a general understanding. So I'm going to play this, and then I'm going to start pulling the limiting ceiling down a little bit. Okay, so I've pulled it down quite far here, as you can see, and you're seeing a bunch of extra information that's being shown at this point. And basically what this is it's telling you how much volume is being reduced, essentially. Again, this isn't an exact explanation. This isn't a precise way of explaining exactly how it works. But generally speaking, the volume is being pulled down by this much. Okay, so if I pull up another limiter, and I play it after I've put the limiting ceiling on it, we can see the volume of everything is now like more or less exactly the same. It's a lot quieter too. So if we take the ceiling off, you see all the dynamic range is back, and then as we pull this ceiling down, we start chopping the top volume off as we go. And this is showing you how much volume is being reduced, essentially. And you can see how it's flattening out over here. So you can pull it all the way down. And like I said, this is just one of the ways to reduce dynamic range. Another way to do this using the fruity limiter is to use the compressor. So if you take this knob that says ratio and you turn it all the way this way, and then you start reducing it, you get a similar effect. And again, it's not exactly the same. And for the third time I'm saying this is not an in-depth explanation on the difference between limiting and compression, but this is a similar, a way that you can get a similar effect, as you can pull the compression threshold down. Okay. So that's two different ways of reducing dynamic range using the fruity limiter. If you know of another way of reducing the dynamic range using the fruity limiter, please feel free to throw it below. I'm sure there is another way, I just can't think of it off the top of my head. So here is the next melody that I have. Here's what it sounds like. I like this melody. I want to reuse it for something. I think I might do that today or tomorrow. But anyway, this is what it sounds like. Okay. And I've also got this kick playing. So another thing you can use the fruity limiter for is something called sidechaining. And a very simple explanation for what sidechaining is if you take the signal for something, so this kick, the signal is being sent to two places. The master chain, which is why you can hear it. Okay, so you can hear it in the master chain because it's going to the master chain. And then there's a signal that's being sent to the fruity limiter, okay, which is right here. And that signal isn't sending volume, it's just sending information. So it's essentially telling the limiter, hey, the kick is playing right now. That's all it's doing. Okay, so once you send this little signal here, no volume is coming through here. Okay, so there's no kick playing in here, but the limiter now knows when the kick is playing, because once the volume from the kick comes in, the limiter goes, oh, kick's in. Okay, so the way that sidechaining is you sidechain it. So you come over here, you right click, hit sidechain to this track, it sends a signal to it. Then you come over here to the limiter, and you go to the compressor. Okay, so you have two little buttons here. You have the limiter button and the compressor button, and they have slightly different menus. So click on the compressor button, and then you come over here to where it says sidechain, right click, and then you come down to where it says kick, or whatever you want to sidechain. In this case, I'm sidechaining my kick. So I select my kick, and still nothing is happening. And the reason nothing is happening is because we have to actually set up the parameters. So the way that you do this is you do it a similar way that I showed you to reduce the dynamic range earlier. You take this ratio and you turn it all the way up, okay? So you turn this all the way up, and then you take the threshold and you start pulling it down. And so since I started pulling it down, now you can see the signal of the kick. So this is the kick signal. So every time the kick comes in, you can see it triggering, okay? So once we pull this threshold down to the kick level, like where the kick is, the volume of this melody is going to be reduced by that much, okay? So nothing's happening right now until I reach down to the level of the kick. And now you can see something happening. What's happening is, at that moment, the kick is coming in, the volume of the melody is being reduced by this much, okay? And if you pull this down, the volume will get reduced by more and more. So if I pull this all the way down, every time the kick comes in, the volume of the melody completely is getting cut out as the kick comes through. So this is like, and something else you can do is you can come over here to this envelope, and I like to keep the attack all the way down because what that does is it makes it so that right as the kick comes in, the volume comes down. If you pull this up, then it'll take a second for the volume to come down after the kick hits, which can be useful, but in this demonstration, that's not what I want. And then you can play with these knobs to determine like how much of that kick volume is actually being reduced. So let me pull this up a little bit so it's easier to see. If you pull this release knob up and the sustain knob up, you're going to see that like the volume that gets reduced ends up getting wider. So let's look at it. So you see it's less like stick-like and, you know, sticking straight down, but it's more like square-like and a little bit wider. So if we pull this all the way up, see how it kind of got a little bit rounder and wider? So typically I like to only reduce the volume at the very start. So I pull the sustain all the way down and the release down, but you can play with these knobs to, you know, figure out exactly what you want. Same thing with this attack. But yeah, play around with these knobs and you can figure out exactly what you want and how much you want this to be reduced by. Typically, this is used with an 808. So I can actually show an example of that. Okay, so something that people often do is they sidechain their kick and their 808, meaning as the 808 and the kick hit at the same time, they want the volume of the 808 to cut out at just the very beginning of that. So we have a kick and an 808 playing at the same time, and oftentimes people will sidechain them because they want that kick to come through at the very beginning of the sound. So they want that punch, and then after that, they want the 808 to kind of fill the space out. So you get that like punch and then that boom, you know, like that thump or, you know, whatever kind of 808 or bass that you're using. And one way to achieve that is by sidechaining. So if we come over here and we go to the limiter, the fruity limiter for the 808, we've got it here. Okay. If you do the same thing, take the kick and sidechain it to the 808, come down here to the compressor, sidechain, click on the kick, okay, pull the ratio all the way to the right, and then start pulling the threshold down. And once you pull the threshold past where the kick is, you're going to see volume starts to get reduced when that kick comes through. Okay, so this is an extreme example. I've just got a bunch of kicks playing at the same time. But that very beginning is the part that people tend to focus on. So they tend to do something like this and reduce the volume of the 808 at just the beginning so that kick can punch through and really be heard. So you have that kick and then the 808 that punches, that fills out the space after that punch. And you can play with these settings and get the sound to be carved out to be thinner like this. Or you can have it be wider. So there are all kinds of different ways to do it. And if you want the sound to come in a little bit later, or to be cut out a little bit later, you can pull the attack down, or up rather. Okay. So there are different ways to use limiter to sidechain different sounds. One more thing that you can use a fruity limiter for is compression and transient shaping. So you can add transients and or compress the sound down using the fruity limiter. So I've got a drum loop added up or put into this thing. So we pull everything back to the way it was. Okay, so it's just like a boom bap sounding drum loop that I made. Okay, it's obviously the wrong tempo for boom bap, but this is just for a demonstration. And you can see the waveform here. So one way that you can compress is by coming down here to the compression tab. Click on that. And then we're going to play with the ratio. Okay, so I've noticed, and again, this is not an in-depth compression video. This is just a general overview of things that you can do and sounds that you can produce. So if you pull this ratio to the right, you are going to tend to compress the sound down. Okay, so as I pull this, if I pull this ratio all the way to the side, as we saw earlier, and I start pulling this threshold down, I'm going to start to reduce the volume of that sound. So let me pull up the... Oh, it's because I had the other thing sidechained to it. Yeah, so if you have nothing sidechained to it, that was my fault. If you have nothing sidechained to it and the ratio is pulled all the way down, it will start to reduce the volume. It will start to compress it down. And if you don't just want the volume to be reduced, which is essentially what's happening here, where the top is being chopped off, if you just want compression, you can just pull this knob up a little bit. So somewhere between all the way down and straight up like this, you're going to get different levels of compression. And the more you go down and flat like this, the more compression is going to actually happen. Okay, so let's just pull it out a little bit and start playing with the threshold. Okay, so in this case, we've just got a small amount of compression going on. If we want, we can pull the threshold down a little bit and make it compress a little bit more. Okay. If we want to compress a little bit more aggressively, we can pull the ratio up a lot. Okay, so that's reducing the volume all the way. This is just compressing less and less and less, okay, until nothing's really happening. Another thing that the fruity limiters can do, and this is kind of what I consider to be the opposite of compression, which is like adding transients. So if we take the exact same drum loop with the same, settings and everything, but we pull the ratio the other direction, we're going to notice something different happen, okay? Okay, so what you should be noticing is it's actually getting louder. Instead of compressing the sound signal down and making it quieter or more compressed or more, I don't know what the sound is, distorted or whatever you want to call it, it's kind of doing the opposite. It's pulling the very beginning of the sound up. And this is what I call adding transients. There's probably a much more technical and more correct way of explaining this. I'm sure there is. But this is kind of the way that I've, learned to understand the way that this function works. And as you pull it down more, you'll see that more transients are being added. Okay, until it gets really blocky and really extreme at the top end. And you can do the same thing. You can play with the ratio, and you can make it do this in a more exaggerated manner. So you can see with the ratio all the way down like this, I'm boosting the transient signal by quite a bit in this case. Okay, and you can do this in small amounts to just kind of give things a little bit more of a punch at the very beginning of a sound. I like to use this function for like hi-hats and kicks at the very beginning, and then later on I might compress them down a little bit just to shape the transients. But if I really want it to punch through and I know that it's a sound that only lasts a very short amount of time, like a hi-hat or something, I tend to use this function just to make it stick out a little bit more. Okay. Let's look at another function of the Fruity Limiter, which is the noise gate. I actually just recently started messing around with this noise gate and learning how to use it, so I'm not the most familiar with it, but this is kind of what I understand so far. So I've got the same. If you come down here to where it says noise gate, you see some different knobs, right? I'm going to go ahead and pull the release pretty much all the way down. And then the first thing I'm going to play with is the threshold. I'm going to leave the gain at halfway. The threshold tells you, like, at what point, at what volume do you want things to be reduced. So the higher that this is, the louder things are that are going to be reduced. I'm doing a terrible job of explaining that. Let me just show it. So if I pull this up, anything below this top line is going to be reduced by this much volume. Okay, so if I pull this all the way up to here, anything below this line is going to be cut in volume by half. Okay, because this is pulled about halfway down. I say half. So whatever's below this line will be cut by, whatever this knob says. So this knob says negative 11. You can see at the very top left corner of the screen, it says negative 11.7 dBs. So the volume, anything below this line will be reduced by about 11 decibels of volume, 11 or 12, okay? So let's see what it sounds like. So I'm going to take the threshold all the way down so it's normal. And then I'm going to start pulling this knob up. And anything below that line is going to be reduced by 11 decibels. So you can see I've just barely pulled it up. And anything below that line is being reduced by almost 12 decibels. And as you can hear, you can't hear the hi-hat anymore. That little tiny hi-hat that was hitting between, you can't hear it at all because it's not loud enough. It doesn't go past this threshold, so that volume is getting reduced by half. So let's keep going up. You can kind of hear it a little bit because the volume is only getting reduced by 11. If I pull this all the way down, though, anything below this line is now getting reduced by infinity, or it's just completely getting reduced to 0. Okay, so if I keep pulling this up, at this point, this is an extreme example. At this point, just the very top end of the kick and the snare is coming through. Everything else is getting reduced by 100% volume. And you can make that reduction even less. So now at this point, everything's getting reduced by, everything underneath this little shaded, the top part of the shaded line is getting reduced by 3.6 decibels now. And you can use this for all kinds of different things. One thing that I've used it for recently is, like, if I'm working with somebody's vocals and there's a little bit of noise, a little bit of background noise, maybe they had a fan on in the room or something, and it's not too loud, you can use this to more or less. And so let's release, you can play with this release as well. It essentially just says, like, how quickly you want the noise to be reduced. So if you pull this all the way up, the noise is being reduced, but it's being reduced, like, later. It's not being reduced right as the sound happens. Whereas if you pull it all the way down, it's being reduced immediately. So you can play with these different settings. Okay, so those are a bunch of different things that you can use the Fruity Limiter for. Again, this is not a comprehensive, compression guide. It's not a comprehensive limiting guide or anything like that. It's not a clipping guide. And I think you can mess around with the settings as well for this to get a clipping effect instead of a limiting effect. Again, I'm not an expert on clipping versus limiting. There are 100, maybe even thousands of videos out there that can explain that better than I can, so go check one of those out. But this is basically the video. These are a lot of the different things that you can use a Fruity Limiter for. These are a bunch of the different functionalities. Hopefully this helps anybody that, is just kind of looking at the Fruity Limiter and going, what are all these knobs? What are these buttons? What does it do? What can this thing do? These are some of the different things that a Fruity Limiter can do.